First, Charles, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So, tell us about the case of Casey Goodson. This has been shaking people up because I don't want to get too far ahead of it. Tell people what happened to Casey Goodson.
So Casey Goodson is a 23-year-old, or was a 23-year-old man, black man who was living in Columbus, Ohio, who last Friday was shot and killed by I believe it was a deputy sheriff or deputy marshal in Columbus, Ohio, as he was attempting to lawfully enter into his own home. He was in possession of a Subway sandwich because he was feeding his grandmother and his younger brother. And Casey Goodson was a lawful conceal and carry firearm owner, which is allowed and legal in the state of Ohio. And there are a number of conflicting stories as to what actually happened on that evening when he was killed. What we do know is that there is significant outrage because at the end of the day, many people, including myself, believe that Mr. Goodson should be alive today. The officer who did shoot him was in plain clothes. It is not clear as to what led up to Mr. Goodson being actually shot at or even followed, in as much as he was not suspected of committing any crime. He was not involved in any investigation or the subject of any investigation. And so it is very unclear as to why the officer actually even followed or fired or stopped or attempted to apprehend Mr. Goodson. Problematic on a number of levels. A week after the shooting, the officer and his attorney released a statement in which they claimed that Mr. Goodson had actually pointed his weapon at him, and it was because of that he fired at Mr. Goodson and ultimately fatally wounded him. The problem with that story is, of course, there are no body cams in Columbus, Ohio. We don't know what happened. There are no dash cams that are going to support what actually happened, and we won't have an autopsy for the next 12 to 14 weeks. There have been conflicting reports. Of course, their lawyers and the officer are claiming that Mr. Goodson was shot in the upper torso, in the side, whereas Casey Goodson's family has said and maintained that he was shot in the back. And so there are a number of different very problematic narratives that are circling around this. But ultimately, as a former prosecutor and as a civil rights attorney, my conclusion is that Casey Goodson should be here to tell his side of the story, whatever that may be.
So where has the NRA been on this so far? I can only imagine if a legal concealed carrying white man were heading back from the subway, headed to his home, and wound up in an altercation with the plainclothes officer and wound up dead. The idea that he was armed would never remotely enter into the minds of the NRA leadership to justify his being dead. I almost feel like a sucker for even asking this question, but has the NRA weighed in this situation?
They have not, and I appreciate that question. It's an important thing to understand that the history of the NRA in America is very much so linked to actually being against or responding to the legal ownership of guns by Black people, and that dates back several decades before now. But we knew this. We knew this going into the situation before Casey Goodson was even brought up. We knew this from Philando Castile, who was killed on the driver's side of his car in Minnesota a few years back. He also was a licensed firearm carrier, and the silence from the NRA was deafening. And so it comes as no surprise that in this instance, the NRA is nowhere to be found in terms of defending the rights of certain Americans to carry firearms, defending of the rights of certain Americans in terms of their Second Amendment liberties. But when it comes to Black people in America, those things don't apply.
When it comes to Philando Castile, has the NRA done any retrospective look at their reaction to that? Because that one was so egregious. Licensed firearm carrier, and you don't have any he said she said about what happened because we have the video of what happened. Has there been any pushback from inside the NRA that has gotten them to apologize for the way that they handle that, or are they comfortable with the impression that they support open carry or concealed carry for some Americans but not other Americans?
I think their silence tells you everything that you need to know about how they feel about that. I don't necessarily know that they've gone as far as to retract anything that they may have said or may not have said in terms of speaking up about the fact that their silence, in fact, was very much so deafening in the cases of Philando Castile and when it comes to blacks and their Second Amendment rights. But we are, like I said, that is very much so consistent with their history. I think on a larger scale, what I find troubling is absent, or if you step beyond the actual individual cases of Philando Castile, or in this case, Casey Goodson, there is a question about how law enforcement is engaging citizens in states that are legal to open carry or have concealed carry licenses. So the idea in a state like or in a jurisdiction like New York City, where I am right now, where it is just prohibitive for you to have a firearm out with you on your person, absent very, very few select circumstances, that engages a certain approach from law enforcement that is understandable because under most circumstances, 99% of the time, that weapon is illegal, right? So that's a different situation. But in these jurisdictions, when law enforcement is fully aware that it's very possible that whomever it is that they are encountering may legally be in possession of that firearm, the conversation needs to be, what is the approach? What are the protocols that are taking place? Because obviously they are not serving all people in the same way. And I think that if there's any failure on the NRA's part, that's perhaps the biggest one. If you step beyond the cases, obviously you don't want to deal with cases that have or that involve black people who are carrying weapons legally. But there's still a larger question as to citizens as a whole in open carry jurisdictions and how those things are being dealt with.
Right. And so at the same time that an agent of the state was executing Goodson, we also had the case of Brandon Bernard, who was also executed very recently. Tell us a little bit about his case.
So what we have here is another example of state-sanctioned violence. After 17 years of a hiatus around federal death penalty cases going to full execution, we have now seen a slew of federal death penalty cases that have carried out executions, with, unfortunately, Brandon Bernard being the most recent. Part of what stirred the national uproar with respect to him was number one, that he was, at the time that he committed the crime and was convicted of the crime, a teenager. He was a teenager and he was executed at the age of 40. And then number two, we found out that during the trial, there was evidence that was withheld by the prosecutor's office from a police officer who was involved with the case that essentially said that, well, they did not believe, law enforcement did not believe that Mr. Bernard was in fact a high-ranking official or a high-ranking member of the gang that he was affiliated with. That mattered because it ultimately was played by the prosecution's office as though he were on par with everyone else who was involved with the crime. He had a much less serious role in the crime than did many of his compatriots, if you will, and ultimately. This was a case that many people had pleaded with the president as well as previous administrations to commute to a life sentence, not asking for his freedom, not asking for his release or his parole, but simply to commute to a life sentence instead of choosing execution, and that was denied. And it is a travesty of justice, and I think it's illustrative of so many different things that are wrong with America's criminal justice system right now.
Right. And aside from the question of the death penalty itself, which is completely barbaric, and also aside from the idea of executing somebody for something they did when they were 18, and what he did, he went along with some buddies of his, and as we know with teenagers, there's a real impulse to just go along and just not rock the boat. He wasn't the one who was kind of in the lead on this. But one thing I want to raise real quickly, because we're running out of time, something you said about his rank in the gang. The jury and the judge were quicker to execute both him and the other, because they said that because of their rank in the gang, they're more likely to commit violence in the
Correct.
future, which seems to me to be executing somebody for something that they have not done yet. And I don't understand how that, forget justice, how that can be constitutional, how that can be legal. How do you punish someone for something they haven't done yet, just on the possibility that they might do it?
Well, you know,
real quickly, because we're running out of time.
Sure,
and I'm sorry for filibustering.
No problem. The notion is that, you know, you want to convince that these people, that this person is the ultimate threat and danger to society. That's just to secure the conviction. That's not talking about the capital punishment phase of the trial, but what that prosecutor was attempting to do and sort of painting that picture, saying that this person needs to be off the streets and they need to have absolutely no chance of being back on the streets, which is what was used to secure the conviction and to sway that jury. But ultimately, what we know is that there are several jurors who have now said that they feel that he did not deserve the death penalty and that they would have voted differently if they had the information, which was also used during the sentencing portion of his trial, as well as if you know, they knew what they knew about modern science in the brain. And so, again, for various reasons, one of which you just hinted on, this is just illustrative of how broken and problematic America's criminal justice system continues to be.
It is. And Joe Biden, once he's sworn in on the first day, ought to commute every single death sentence. Charles Coleman, thank you so much for joining us here on The Conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat, emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.